Alright, so this is the very end of my coverage of Chapter 3 in Ethnocultural Psychology on critical thinking. Now, in our previous lectures, I have been talking about different biases that people have that kind of twist or distort their perception of other people or of the world in general. And so we're going to talk about two more of those in this lecture. So I'll begin by having a little discussion here. So have you ever seen this phenomenon of products being advertised as being all natural or 100% natural? Well, what's that supposed to mean? Why do advertisers use this strategy of saying that something is natural? So think about that. Well, what about when something is described as being unnatural? What types of emotions does that usually convey? Well, this is what we call the naturalistic fallacy. Right? This is also sometimes known as the is-ought fallacy by some philosophers. They're very similar to one another. And it's the belief that many people have that if something is a certain way, or if something is naturally a certain way, then that's the right way for it to be. That's how it ought to be. So if something is called or labeled as natural, then the assumption is that that is morally good or morally superior. Whereas if something is called unnatural, usually people will jump to the conclusion that there's something bad about that. So sometimes that's correct, but it isn't necessarily the case that that is correct. So there are lots of things that are perfectly natural that we think of as being very bad or unpleasant. Cancer, for example. Cancer is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It isn't always due to things like artificial preservatives and all that. It can just be something that happens naturally in people. Some people have a genetic predisposition toward cancer. It's just a product of their biology. Murder is another thing. There's lots of evidence suggesting that that it's natural for human beings to have some murderous impulses, to want to do terrible things to other people when they are angry at them or when they've been wronged. But we generally regard murder as not being a morally good thing. Then there's prejudice, like racial prejudice and prejudice along the lines of religion and things like that. That's something that is just a natural side effect of human psychology. Some researchers have even suggested that the psychological processes that lead to prejudice may have been beneficial at some point in our evolution. It may have been adaptive or helpful to fear things that were different or fear people who were different from ourselves. But in the modern world, it typically causes more harm than good. And so it's generally regarded in our society as being a bad thing. And then here's just another example. Flesh-eating bacteria. Flesh-eating bacteria evolved. It's a natural phenomenon, but we typically find this type of thing to be terrible, even though it's a natural type of thing. Right? It comes from nature. So these are just some examples of things that are natural that are considered bad. There are also things that are unnatural that we consider to be very good things, or at least morally neutral. So one example would be technology. Technology can be a very good, useful thing that can be helpful to people. It isn't always good, but it isn't necessarily bad just because it's artificial, just because it's not natural. Right? So another example of this that's a more specific type of technology would be artificial implants. Like, I actually have an artificial heart valve. I had an infection in my heart that was discovered in 2010, and they had to crack me open and replace my aortic valve with this stainless steel valve. And so I wouldn't be alive today if not for this artificial thing that's clicking away inside my chest right now. So that's something that most people would view as a good development. It's an artificial thing, an unnatural thing that saves people's lives. Right? And there are many other examples along these lines. So another, just one last example of something that's natural that's usually considered to be bad would be natural disasters. I mean, think about all these things like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, that just devastate people's lives and even kill people many times. So even though those are by definition natural, most people wouldn't say that they are like, good things. Right? You might even regard them as morally neutral. It's not like they're intending to kill people. It just happens as a natural side effect of this natural phenomenon. Okay, but the bottom line for this is that you can't use the status quo, the way that something is right now or is naturally, to suggest that that is morally superior. So whenever you're evaluating the moral goodness or badness of some phenomenon, it's necessary to do an independent moral analysis. So do something like look at how much benefit it provides to people, or how much pleasure it provides to people, to how much it hurts people, how much damage it does. And so sometimes this can lead to some controversies within psychology. So for example, there's a lot of controversy that revolves around reports of naturally occurring sex differences. So if there are sex differences reported in something like intelligence or mental abilities, or sometimes even physical abilities, people sometimes get kind of upset by that. They get offended by it. And part of the reason why people can get upset by this is this valid concern that some people might hear that, oh, well, there's a naturally occurring difference between men and women, and say, oh, so it's okay, it's justifiable if men and women are treated differently, because they are actually different in terms of their basic biology. But that is a very controversial claim, and it is not correct. It goes along with this fallacy of the is-ought fallacy. Just because men and women might be physically different from one another, that doesn't mean that it's morally justifiable to discriminate against somebody on the basis of sex. So you have to do that independent moral analysis to determine that. So this is very similar to something that we'll talk about in Chapter 5 in this class, which is the controversial debate over racial differences in intelligence. So the concern there is that, well, if we find that that members of a certain racial group tend to get lower IQ scores, then that might just be used to explain away any inequalities within society, like those differences in rates of poverty and unemployment between different racial groups. And so obviously that's going to be a very controversial claim, because just because a group might score differently using some measure, that first of all doesn't mean that they are different. That might be a bias of that measurement. But even if they are really different, that doesn't necessarily make it morally justifiable to treat them differently, or to treat one group as being lesser than another. So the bottom line for this is just to remember that because something is natural, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. Right? Okay, so that's the naturalistic fallacy in a nutshell. Just remember that because something's natural, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Because it's unnatural, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And the last thing that I wanted to go over in this chapter is this phenomenon of belief perseverance. Right? And I've sort of alluded to this one before when I've said that on a very fundamental level, you can see that people love to be right. They love to feel like their beliefs about the way that the world is are true. And at the same time, they hate being wrong, they hate hearing the suggestion that their beliefs are false or flawed in some way. And so for this reason, it's often tempting for people to cling to their beliefs. even when they are confronted with evidence that suggests that their beliefs are wrong. Right? So we tend to be biased in favor of maintaining our existing beliefs. I had talked about this earlier when we went over the assimilation bias, that it's easier or more natural for people to distort their perception of evidence so that they can maintain their existing beliefs than to view the evidence more objectively and be forced to alter their beliefs. That would be that accommodation. And this is related to another type of very similar bias, which is the confirmation bias. So when we're going out and observing the world, we tend to be more likely to view the evidence, to view the world in a biased way that supports our existing beliefs. We will tend to pay extra attention to information that is in line with our beliefs, while at the same time ignoring or disregarding information that conflicts with our beliefs. And so there's a classic study on belief perseverance that was done back in the late 1970s by Lord, Ross, and Lepper, and you can get more detail on this one in your textbook. But what these researchers did was they started off by recruiting some participants who either supported or opposed the use of capital punishment, the death penalty. Right? And so 24 of these people supported it, 24 were fundamentally opposed to it. So they brought them in for this research, and they had them all read 2 papers. Right? And one of these papers was written in a way that confirmed that the death penalty is an effective deterrent to violent crime. Right? So it suggested that there is this evidence showing that in places that have the death penalty, people are less likely to commit serious criminal acts, and especially violent crime. The other paper said the opposite. It said that there is really no evidence that the death penalty is an effective deterrent to serious violent crime. Right? And so after reading these 2 papers, the participants rated the results of the papers, how convincing the results were, and they rated how good they thought the procedures used by these researchers were. And as you might guess, based on what we've been talking about for belief perseverance and confirmation bias, what they found was that the participants found the study that supported their existing beliefs to be the more convincing study. Right? So, in other words, if they came in supporting the death penalty, supporting capital punishment, then they thought that this paper that said that it is an effective deterrent was a really well done paper, very convincing, solid methods. Whereas this other paper that says it wasn't an effective deterrent, they thought, oh, those researchers were just biased, they had some flawed method, they weren't measuring the right thing. And if the people came in opposing capital punishment, then you saw the opposite pattern, where they kind of disregarded the results of the paper, saying that it is an effective deterrent, and they said, that's just rotten research. It wasn't well done. The researchers were biased in that other direction, and the people who opposed capital punishment really liked the other paper that said that it isn't an effective deterrent. It doesn't work. And furthermore, after being exposed to these 2 papers, the participants' original attitudes actually got stronger. So if they started off slightly supporting capital punishment and were then exposed to this information, when they left, their original attitude had gotten even stronger in favor of capital punishment. If they started off opposed to capital punishment and were then exposed to this information, then their original attitude again became stronger. They were even more opposed than when they started. Now, rationally, you would think that people would moderate their beliefs. So if you have a belief that something is a certain way and then you see 2 conflicting bits of evidence, then rationally you should say, well, I'm not sure. This paper says one thing, this one says another, so maybe the distinction between whether this works or doesn't work isn't as clear as I originally thought. But that isn't what people do, because they are just so in favor of clinging to their original beliefs. Right? So one tip for dealing with belief perseverance is to, first of all, try to keep an open mind when you're thinking about things. And as I've said many times before, just consider the possibility that your beliefs could be flawed, they could be wrong. We don't like to do that, but it's necessary for critical thinking. And then another idea is to intentionally try to play the role of devil's advocate sometimes. So if you're not familiar with what this means, it's arguing in favor of the opposing side. This can be a very helpful strategy for critical thinking. Take this new perspective that you wouldn't naturally be inclined to take, and this will allow you to have a new, kind of fresh perspective on the evidence and can help you to avoid some of the biases that come with belief perseverance. And last of all, just remember that you might be wrong. I mean, we like to think that we're right, but of course we're never right about everything. All right. And overall, just some final concluding tips for this section on critical thinking is to, first of all, try to be aware of your own biases, all the things that we've talked about throughout this chapter. And be sure to think carefully. That's the bottom line for critical thinking, is to be skeptical about your own beliefs, as well as claims made by other people. Another good rule of thumb here is to avoid going with your gut or your gut feeling, and instead carefully and cautiously evaluate the evidence. And then one last hazard when it comes to not thinking critically is being in a hurry. So people are more likely to rely on these heuristics, these mental shortcuts, when they are either really tired, so they don't have the energy to do critical thinking, or when they're in a big hurry, they're in a rush to get to some conclusion. Then they're not going to stop to take the time to critically analyze their beliefs or to get as much evidence as possible before making a decision. Okay, and so that's, as I said, the conclusion of this chapter on critical thinking. So thank you very much for your attention.